Hey everyone, continuing on in our letter from Pliny to Tacitus, and this is line, let's see where we pick up, sed aurea, line 167 in Richard Lafleur's edition of Wheelock's Latin Reader. Sed aurea ex qua diaita adibatur ita iam cinere mixtisque pomicibus opleta surrexerat ut si longior in cubiculo mora exitus negaretur. Let's stop there. That'll be the whole scope of today, or not today, but just this lesson. So, but that's a nice starting. Well, what were we talking about? We're going to need that to make sense of this but, this conjunction. So we had just seen that Pliny the Elder was going to sleep despite the fact that there are flames on the mountain. He's just said, well, whatever. So, but, and people could hear him snoring as they were walking by the bedroom. But the area, and of course we have the word area here, but this is more literally the courtyard. For those of you who might be archaeologists or know a little bit about Roman villas, you'd have all these open spaces, these areas, around which you would have a kind of covered awning with columns here. It was all very nice. You might have some fountains on the inside or a pool. This might be called in a Greek or the peristyle, the kind of thing that walks around, and then off of this you would have a lot of individual rooms, drinking rooms, whatever, but they were all access to this main kind of outside hall, and you could do this because it's the Mediterranean. It's a fairly nice climate, so we can imagine that Pliny the Elder is sleeping in here, and it might just be an open lentil here. He's sleeping in without a door, and then people have been walking by and hearing him snore. We've got some large Z's coming out of there. That's the and then this would be part of a large villa that took up a lot of space on the side of the mountain. But we don't need to worry about the geography right now. We need to worry about the Latin. So this area, this courtyard, out of which, so this qua referring back to this, but a courtyard out of which the dieta, this is Pliny's the Elder's room, so that's going to be singular, nominative, feminine, adibatur. So adire, so we've seen a couple times, is to approach. So this is, it was being approached. The room out of which, or the courtyard out of which the room was being approached. That is, the one that the door, there was a door, there was a portal from this room that opened up onto the courtyard. So, but the courtyard from which the room was approached, okay, thus, at that time, Yam, so was in such a state at that time, Cinere, so we've seen this before, ablative, meaning ash, and mixed, and pumice stones having been mixed. So pumice having been mixed. Opleta, finally we get something that makes a little bit of sense here. This is, again, a perfect participle having been filled up. And that's the dieta. So this is our subject verb. We might supply est here. So, but the courtyard out of which the dieta was being filled up. Sorry, so it's not the dieta. That's not. So the area is the subject of opleta. And then I said that was probably short, but we don't know yet. Having been filled, this could all, believe it or not, and we haven't had too many of these in Pliny as opposed to Livy, this could all be an ablative absolute, where we've got with the courtyard having been filled up. And indeed that makes a bit of sense because surrexerat, which is going to be our main verb, so this is from Surgo. Might remember that energy drink from the 90s, Surge. This verb always makes me think of this. But this surrexi is the third principal part, the perfect part. Insurrection is a word that we get from this, rising up. So what this is, if we make it surrexerat, what tense mood could that be if we've got erat on the end of a perfect? This is going to be pluperfect, active, indicative. So he had gotten up when, we might say, the courtyard had been filled The courtyard, which one? Well, the courtyard out of which his room was approached was filled up already kind of at that point in this way with ash and with mixed pumice stones. So that's not a good sign. You might think he's been on the ship and that wasn't sinking, but this is almost like sinking as the ground is being filled up around you with volcanic detritus, right? Ut, as kind of, we got a purpose clause here. If longer in cubiculo, the bedroom, mora. So here, longior, we know that this is a comparative adjective. It's a nominative. It could be masculine or singular. Here we get mora, which can work with. So if longer delay in the cubiculum, and we're going to want a verb here, Lafleur helps us out with this imperfect subjunctive esset. Exitus negaretur. The exit and escape would be denied. So we've got here what might be called a present contrary to fact conditional going on here. The present contrary to facts help when you have imperfect subjunctive in the if clause and what we call the protasis. Remember, I brought this up in class the other day, but not online. The protasis is the if clause. It's going to be the if through the end of the if. And then the then clause is the apodosis. A-P-O-D-O-S-I-S. These are both Greek terms. And it just means if clause, then clause. It's a fancy way to do it. And it's useful in Latin because there is no then. You know, we could talk about a C clause and use that instead of the protasis, but there's really no good way to call something that's the then clause in Latin with a Latin appropriate word. So we use apodosis here. So when we've got an imperfect subjunctive in the protasis and an imperfect subjunctive in the apodosis, this is generally a present contrary to fact. But note that these kind of specialized terms, I mentioned this also in class, are kind of made up out of convenience. We have this imperfect subjunctive here in part because of this ut clause. We've got a purpose here. He got up because if longer delay were to happen in the bedroom, an exit, an escape would be denied. So this is actually why this is imperfect, or sorry, subjunctive, somewhat goes with the ut, and why it's imperfect somewhat goes with this contrary to fact. And of course, even though it's present, we're talking about a historical situation here. I want to just point out that things can get messy in these situations. We don't know why it's subjunctive. It could be subjunctive for a couple of reasons. The thing is not to push too hard on this, especially at a kind of second-year Latin level. If you are just recognizing that this would work in either situation, you're doing great. That's all that really needs to be hammered out. And you should also know that, just like in English where we sometimes neglect using the subjunctive, Latin speakers weren't always completely grammatical with this. It's easy to structure in a book following, kind of masters like Cicero and Caesar, who are in many ways defining what we think is good in the Latin language, whether or not their contemporaries felt that way. There's a tendency to think that, there's clearly a right way and a wrong way to do Latin. And really, we're kind of following our right way. One thing I mentioned Caesar here, Julius Caesar, of course, successful general, everyone knows who he is. Also a writer, he wrote his own commentaries on the two wars that he was a part of, the wars in Gaul, and then ultimately what are called the Civil Wars, when he's back duking it out, kind of ultimately to rule Rome, or at least keep it away from nasty guys like Pompey the Great. Anyway, well, nasty to Caesar. We have all of this going on. There's a scholar at Stanford right now. His name is Christopher Krebs. He had been at Harvard but just moved over a couple of years ago, and he's done a lot to show how Caesar's writings might actually be as kind of valuable historically as the man's martial and political outcome. So I think that's probably a little bit hard to push. leading into the Roman Empire out of the Roman Republic has huge consequences for the rest of Western European history. Whether or not his writing was good and appreciated, has maybe a slightly less strong effect. But Krebs is making the argument that Caesar is important and was important not only for his military explorations, but also for his use of Latin, helping to define what is proper Latin. He and Cicero, these two contemporaries who we really treat as our masters of Latin prose. And in part because they are so canonized, I don't want to spend too much time with either of them. I want to kind of get these other voices, the Livies, the Plinius. Not that these guys aren't also classics and overstudied in their own ways, but normally at this level you're reading Cicero, you're reading Caesar. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to talk about explosions and twin births and suckling at a wolf's mammary glands. There's a lot of exciting things going on in our class instead. All right, enough blither blather. We'll pick up at Excitatus in the next lesson. See you then.